My name's Jack. I've been deployed before, but never to a place like this. The orders had come through with hardly a word about what to expect, just that I was to fill the place of a guy named Eric, who died 2 weeks ago under unusual circumstances. No one went into detail. They just said it wasn't combat related. Maybe I didn't want to know. When I arrived at the base, I noticed right away that something felt off. It wasn't the location. Remote bases in the desert always have a certain emptiness to them. No, this was something else. The air felt thick, heavy, like the desert was hiding something, waiting. My bunkmate, a guy named Miller, was the quiet type. But as soon as I got there, he handed me a pair of earplugs. "You'll need these," he said, his face pale, voice low. I laughed, thought he was messing with me. But he didn't laugh back. Instead, he just nodded toward the window, out into the endless dark of the desert. The first few nights passed without incident. Just the sounds of the wind stirring up dust and the occasional coyote call. But on the fourth night, I was woken up by a faint noise, like a whisper carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was Miller snoring or maybe just the desert playing tricks on me. But the sound grew, turning into a soft, agonizing moan. I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to the isolation and the eerie silence. But every night after that, the sounds would return, growing louder, closer. It was like someone was out there, calling for help, their voice broken, weak. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I got up and went outside. The air was deathly still, the kind of silence that presses against you like a weight. I strained my ears, trying to locate the direction of the sound. And then, in the distance, I saw something, a shadow moving slowly across the desert sands. It didn't make sense. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but miles of barren land. No one should have been out there at this hour, and certainly not in this part of Iraq. I tried to convince myself it was just one of the other soldiers, maybe on patrol. But the way it moved, slow, aimless, like it was searching for something, sent a chill down my spine. I went back inside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Miller noticed. The next morning, he pulled me aside, his voice barely above a whisper. "You saw him, didn't you?" "Who?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady, though I already knew what he meant. "They don't talk about it officially," he said, his face pale, "but everyone here knows Eric's still around." He hesitated, glancing around as if he expected someone, or something, to be listening. "They say he walks the desert at night, looking for a way back." I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers started again, closer than ever, barely audible but piercing. It felt like they were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My heart pounded as I lay in the darkness, waiting for it to end. But the sound didn't go away. The next evening, I stayed up late, hoping to confront whatever was out there. Midnight passed, then 1 a.m., then 2. The silence was absolute. But as I started to let my guard down, that moaning returned, louder, as if it was coming right from the edge of the base. I grabbed my flashlight and went out, scanning the perimeter. And then I saw him, a shadowy figure at the edge of the base, shrouded in moonlight. He stood there, unmoving, looking out toward the desert. I called out, "Hey! Who's there?" My voice was steadier than I felt. The figure didn't turn, didn't respond. It just started walking, drifting, into the desert. I felt compelled to follow, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay put. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, as if leading me somewhere. After a few hundred yards, it stopped. I was close enough now to make out the faint outline of a face, and my blood ran cold. It was Eric. Or at least, something that looked like him. I stood there, frozen, as he turned to face me, his eyes empty, hollow. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Just a faint rasp, like dry leaves in the wind. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He raised a hand, pointing to the ground. There, at his feet, was something half buried in the sand. I crouched down, digging with my hands, heart pounding. Finally, I uncovered it, a torn piece of fabric stained dark with blood. When I looked up, he was gone. The desert was empty once more, silent and unforgiving. Back at the base, I couldn't shake the image of Eric's hollow face. I tried to talk to Miller, but he was too shaken, muttering something about how they warned him not to stay up after midnight, not to listen. But how could I ignore it? How could anyone? That night, I lay awake, waiting. Just before dawn, I heard it again, a whisper so close, it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. The next morning, I found a small note under my bunk, written in shaky, almost illegible handwriting, "He won't stop. Not until he finds rest." I was shaken, but something inside me felt a pull to help Eric find that peace he sought. I couldn't ignore it, couldn't shake the feeling that something unresolved was keeping him here. That night, just before midnight, I went back to the spot in the desert where I'd seen him. I stood there, waiting, calling his name softly. At first, there was only silence. But then, in the distance, I saw his shadow again. He was there, just at the edge of my flashlight's reach, a silent figure lost in the night. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, then turned and began to walk further into the desert. I followed, feeling as if I was drawn by something beyond my control. We walked until we reached a small rise. There, in the sand, lay something glinting faintly in the moonlight, a set of dog tags, half buried. I picked them up, my hands trembling as I read the name. It was Eric's. In that moment, I understood. This is where he had died, where he'd been left. A forgotten soldier, waiting to be found. I placed the tags carefully back in the sand and said a quiet prayer. And then, for the first time, the desert was silent, truly silent. When I looked up, he was gone. The presence that had haunted me for nights was finally at peace. I turned back toward the base, feeling lighter, as if a weight had lifted from my chest. As I reached the base, Miller was waiting. He looked at me, and for the first time, he smiled. Neither of us said a word, but we knew. Eric had finally found his rest. My name is David. I've been with the Army for nearly a decade, and in all my time on the field, I've seen my share of things that make your stomach churn, things that haunt you. I was trained to stay calm under fire, to be the steady hand, the level head. But nothing could prepare me for that night in Iraq. I was part of the support team that evening. Our orders were simple: stand by, stay alert, and be ready to step in only if things went wrong. We were tasked with supporting the main squad, who were already on the ground, conducting a high-stakes operation against an armed militia rumored to have control over a small village. It was supposed to be a routine mission, intense but manageable. I'd done missions like this dozens of times. We waited in silence, our radios on, each of us tuned to every static pop and distant transmission. The main team moved into position, and for the first hour, all was quiet, almost too quiet. But then, out of nowhere, the connection with the main team became spotty. Voices crackled in and out, and soon it was nothing but static. I remember turning to my teammate, a young guy named Mark, and seeing the same doubt and unease reflected in his eyes. We thought it was just the equipment or maybe interference from the landscape. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Then an hour. And still, nothing. That kind of silence? It's worse than gunfire. The uncertainty starts to creep in, digging into your nerves, tightening your chest. Finally, our commander made the call. We were going in. As we moved toward the coordinates, an unsettling feeling washed over me. There was something thick in the air, something I couldn't shake. We arrived at the location, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was the coppery, metallic scent of blood. And not just a trace. The ground was smeared with it, patches of dark red glistening under our flashlight beams. And then I saw it, a message scrawled in what looked like fresh blood across the windshield of a Humvee. It read, "Run." Those 3 letters seemed to glow in the darkness, each stroke dripping with a sense of warning, almost as if someone or something had scrawled it in desperation. A thick fog started to creep in around us, as if called by some invisible force. It wasn't just any fog, it was dense, suffocating, almost unnatural. Within moments, we were surrounded, our visibility reduced to mere feet. I could barely see the guy next to me, his face lost in the swirling gray. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I strained to listen, I realized the whispers were real. Muffled and distant, they rose and fell, like voices carried on the wind. I couldn't make out any words, but the tone was chilling, haunting. Shadows began to move within the fog, darting in and out, close but always just beyond our reach. They were quick, elusive. My pulse raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing about it made sense. "David," Mark whispered beside me, his voice shaking. Do you see them?" I nodded, unable to form words. The shadows seemed almost human but distorted, as though something was stretching them, twisting their forms. The fog thickened, and the whispers grew louder, echoing around us. One of the other guys, Jenkins, stumbled back, his eyes wide, a look of raw terror on his face. This isn't right," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here." Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of something closer, a figure, just beyond my reach, standing perfectly still. Its outline was human but wrong, somehow. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized it was watching me, its hollow eyes fixed, its mouth twisted in an unnatural grin. The fog closed in tighter, and a chill seeped into my bones. Jenkins turned to bolt, but as he moved, a shadow lunged from the mist, swallowing him in one swift motion. We heard his muffled scream cut off abruptly, leaving only an eerie silence behind. "Go!" I shouted to the others, snapping them out of their frozen state. "Move, now!" We turned and ran, not daring to look back. I could feel the shadows closing in, like icy fingers reaching out to grab me, to pull me back into the fog. I stumbled, my breath coming in ragged gasps as we fought to escape. We didn't stop until we were miles from the site, our legs giving out, chests heaving. When we finally turned around, the fog was gone. It was as if nothing had happened. No blood, no shadows, no whispers, only the empty desert stretching out behind us. The next day, a search team returned to the site. They found nothing unusual, no signs of blood, no message on the windshield, no evidence of our encounter. It was as if the night had swallowed it all whole. To this day, I still don't know what we encountered out there. But I remember the words scrawled on that windshield, the last warning from some lost soul, telling us to run. And I can still hear those whispers echoing in my mind, reminding me of something I can never unsee. My name's Nicholas, and I'd barely been in the military for 2 months when I got my first night patrol assignment. Basic training had been more intense than I'd expected, and it left little room for sleep. Every night, after grueling hours of drills, I'd crash into bed, barely able to keep my eyes open. But in those brief, fitful moments between consciousness and sleep, I'd hear things, odd sounds that echoed through the old barracks, whispers that seemed to bounce off the walls. There was a story that circulated around the barracks, one that the seasoned soldiers would mention only in hushed voices. They called it the ghost of Eliza. Eliza had been a recruit, like me, assigned to night patrol just like the one I was about to undertake. A few months ago, they found her body near the old storage buildings, lifeless and strangely cold to the touch, even though it had been a hot night. Nobody really knew what had happened to her. All the official report stated was that her death was an accident. But in the darkness of the barracks, when the lights went out and only the shadows remained, everyone whispered that her spirit lingered. When I was assigned that night to patrol the perimeter near the storage building, I didn't want to admit it, but the stories had started to mess with my head. especially when I found out I'd be patrolling that very area. The chill settled into my bones the moment I heard about it. My partner that night was Mark, a quiet guy who didn't seem fazed by much. But even he looked a bit paler when he found out where we'd be heading. As we suited up, Mark whispered to me, "You've heard about Eliza, right?" He had this strange look on his face, like he was torn between laughing it off and admitting he was as spooked as I was. I nodded, not wanting to reveal how much the story had gotten under my skin. We headed out around midnight, the air thick and humid, and an unsettling silence settled over the whole camp. The only sounds were our footsteps crunching on the gravel and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. As we approached the patrol route, I started feeling an almost magnetic pull from the darkness around the storage buildings, as though something unseen was drawing us in. Every instinct in my body screamed that something was wrong. We walked in silence for a while, checking the perimeter and listening for any disturbances. Then, out of nowhere, I thought I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that at first, I dismissed it as my imagination. But when I looked over at Mark, I could tell he'd heard it too. "Did you hear that?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just the wind," I replied, trying to convince myself as much as him. But the whisper grew louder. It wasn't just a breeze. It was a voice. Faint. Distant. But undeniably a voice. And then, clear as day, it called out my name. Nicholas. I stopped dead in my tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Mark and I looked at each other, his face pale in the dim moonlight. Did that just say your name?" he whispered. I nodded, too stunned to respond. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. As we continued, trying to ignore the unsettling sound, a dense mist began to roll in, enveloping us slowly, blurring the world around us. It was so thick that I could barely see a few feet ahead. Mark kept close to me, his breathing shallow and fast. We both knew we shouldn't go any further, but something about that mist, about the voice, compelled us to keep moving. We rounded the corner near the storage sheds, and that's when we saw it, faint footprints in the dirt, like someone had recently walked there barefoot. They led around the shed, disappearing into the mist. "Maybe it's just some of the guys messing with us," Mark whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. We followed the prints cautiously, every nerve in my body on high alert. And then, without warning, the silence shattered. A piercing scream echoed through the air, a sound so raw, so full of agony, that it froze us both in place. Mark grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here." I wanted to agree. I wanted to run as fast as I could back to the barracks. But something held me there, some strange, unseen force that seemed to grip my very soul, refusing to let me move. Then the whispers started again, louder this time, coming from all around us. It was like dozens of voices murmuring at once, words we couldn't understand, layered and indistinct. But beneath it all, I could make out one voice, clear and unmistakable. Nicholas. Mark. Mark's grip on my arm tightened. "This isn't happening," he kept repeating under his breath, as if saying it enough times might make it true. We turned to leave, but as we did, a dark figure appeared through the mist, just a few feet ahead of us. It was a woman, her features blurred, her eyes wide and filled with something I could only describe as despair. Her mouth opened, as if she was about to scream, but no sound came out. Then, in the silence, she mouthed a single word, "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing Mark by the shoulder, I took off running, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. We sprinted back toward the barracks, neither of us daring to look back. The mist seemed to part before us, but the whispers followed, haunting, echoing, like shadows chasing us through the night. When we finally reached the safety of the barracks, we stopped, gasping for breath, looking back into the darkness. The mist had vanished, and the night was silent once again. But I knew, in my gut, that something had been out there with us. Something that was still watching, waiting. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard the whispers, felt that cold, suffocating presence surrounding me. And the next day, when I asked around, nobody else seemed to know about the mist, the footprints, the scream. They all just stared at me like I was crazy. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And even now, sometimes late at night, when the wind howls through the empty barracks and the shadows dance along the walls, I can still hear her whispering my name.